Well, I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us today here for this webinar. My name is Craig Gordon, one of the vice presidents at Prevail. I'm very excited to share what I believe is an extremely impactful strategy to create legacy through amplified giving. And there's a lot of rhetoric right now going on in Washington as it relates to wealth and the taxation of that wealth. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And so from that perspective, how do we control that? How do we mitigate it? How do we plan for tomorrow's distribution, both to ourselves and ultimately to our beneficiaries? At Prevail, for those that you don't know, we do things a little differently. And while the majority of the industry, we believe, is focused primarily on managing wealth, Prevail's focused on creating it, leveraging it, and protecting it. And so in line with this, I'm excited to introduce Bruce. Bruce is a 40-plus year industry veteran. I'll even say he's probably closer to 50-year plus veteran in the industry, but he spent the majority of his career working for insurance companies at a leadership executive level. He's developed products in the industry, many of which some of you may hold today. He has been a frequent speaker and author at industry publications and events. And he's also my father, which makes it even more enjoyable. I'll credit him with bringing me into the industry, but I will also credit myself with bringing him back out of retirement to talk about this particular subject matter that candidly both of us are passionate about. And so again, I'm excited to introduce Bruce, talking about essentially how can we as individuals, as families, better control our financial legacy. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dad.
All right. Well, thank you, Craig. It's always fun to be introduced by your son. I called this program Legacy Planning for Retirees, an outside the box discussion. And I'm going to explain that in just a minute. But first, I want to start talking about families in general. And I'm going to guess that I'll speak for everyone that's on this call in that for each of us, our families are our number one priority. They always have been. They always will be. Our concern for their well-being never wanes. In fact, in many respects, those concerns seem to grow larger as we grow older. Perhaps that's because we draw nearer to the time that we may not be around to help them. And of course, helping them however we can is just part of our parental DNA. And our conclusion is often, how in the world are they going to survive without us? Now, that may be an exaggeration, but that concern is often justified when it comes to future finances. And then the reaction changes and the conclusion changes to how will they survive with taxes that high? I've seen the projections, I've seen the debate, listened to the debate. A lot of it's going on right now. I'm sure you have too. And only now that without us changes to with future tax policies, with future regulations, with future legislation. And those are all legitimate concerns. And they're concerns because they affect our inheritances. They affect the legacy that we intend to leave. And so it's important to know how to sustain that, how to assure that it endures, and how to protect it going forward. And therefore, that is the subject of this whole presentation. I've called this presentation an outside the box discussion. And how many of you, I can't obviously see you, but how many of you remember the origin of the term outside the box? I think it stemmed from a puzzle that we used to play as kids. And the puzzle was 9 dots. That was the box. And the challenge was, how do you connect all 9 dots with just 4 straight lines without taking your pencil off the paper? And it would drive you crazy until you figured out how to do it. And the answer was that you had to go outside the box. You had to change your perspective by challenging the orthodoxy. And of course, the orthodoxy was that the box is sacrosanct. It was defined by those 9 dots. No one said you could go outside the dots, but that's how you change perspectives and how you think a little differently. So the goal of this presentation is to hopefully change your perspective by challenging some of the orthodoxy involving a better way to pass on an inheritance, and one that can create substantial enduring value for beneficiaries. If at the end of this whole presentation, your conclusion was, wow, I never knew that, then I will have met the goal. I've structured this in such a way that we'll start with the what, then we'll go to the why, and finally the solutions. And the solutions are going to be all outside the box ideas. Before we begin, though, I want to let you know this presentation has been rated for mature audiences. It's intended for retirees. It is not intended to provide specific legal, tax, or financial advice to anybody listening in here. So for that, you need to consult your own advisor. So viewer discretion is so advised. So let's begin. When you hear the term I'm retired or I'm nearing retirement, I'm at that age, what does that mean? I'm going to suggest to you that it's simply that point in our lives when the importance of accumulating wealth is subordinated by our desire to utilize that wealth, however we choose to do that. And wealth, what does that mean? Well, it's not some preordained numerical threshold that's defined by others. Instead, it's whatever amount we individually consider to be sufficient to free us financially, and proudly so that we can focus on things that we want to do, not have to do. Our legacy is actually forged from this wealth, and thus protecting, sustaining, and preserving it becomes the basis of the term legacy planning. Our legacy is actually carried on by our beneficiaries, and it's done intangibly through all the memories that they have, inherited skills, relationships that they have because of us, but also tangibly through all the inherited monies and other physical assets that I like to affectionately call leftovers that we intend to leave to the beneficiaries. And that has largely been the province of estate planning, all the legal maneuverings, documents, et cetera, that enable that to take place. But it's also the province of legacy planning. Legacy planning is different from estate planning. It's not the end of life stuff, and it's activated and fulfilled before our death. It's multidimensional, both intangible and tangible, we're only going to focus on the tangible. And it involves planning and managing today, not only for ourselves, but also for our beneficiaries, and doing it in such a way that we mitigate all the potential woulda, coulda, shoulda judgments that our beneficiaries are going to make. And so we want to make sure that those are the best possible. So estate planning assures that an inheritance is passed on most effectively. That's the legalese side of it. Legacy planning assures that there will actually be a valuable inheritance to pass on. So the goals of tangible legacy planning, obviously, number one, stay very self-sufficient during retirement. We certainly do not want to run out of money. We'd like to maintain sufficient additional money for all the discretionary things we'd like to do, what my father used to call fun and frolic, and preserve as many leftovers as possible and assure that they are in fact deemed to be valuable and they're structured in such a way that they will endure. The concerns are how best to preserve and structure all these leftovers without jeopardizing our own retirement needs. And how do we mitigate the risk of what I'll call tangible legacy adversaries? These are economic and market fluctuations, government regulations, tax policies. These are all things that we can't control, but to which we must react if we are to do this effectively. So let's look at each one of them quickly. Economic and market fluctuations. As we get older, we're advised to modify our investment risk profile, move from a more aggressive growth strategy to a more preservation of capital strategy. That's important. It limits volatility. We want to make sure we've got the money. It improves predictability of returns. That's very important as we go forward. If we've left our jobs, we now are living on investments primarily. And we want to improve liquidity so that we can get at that money if we ever need it. I'm going to show you a very outside the box idea in this regard in just a minute. Government regulations. These are something we are all attuned to if we're retired. We start out with things like Social Security and Medicare and prescription drug coverage and Part A's and Part B's. And then we learn about Medicare Advantage and donut holes and Medigap and things that are covered and aren't covered. And there's filing deadlines and there's penalties if we do things and penalties if we don't. Some things we're too old and some things we're too young. There are restrictions if we're employed, restrictions if we're not employed. There's income restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. Retirement was supposed to be uncomplicated. And not long ago, a relatively new concern propped up called the Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act. Don't ask me how they come up with these names, but they came up with that in 2019. It was in effect as of January 1st, 2020, and it's called the Secure Act. The purpose of the Secure Act was actually to increase retirement savings by expanding the use of tax-deferred retirement accounts, things like IRAs, including Roth IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, 457s, et cetera. It does not cover individually owned annuities. Now, all of that sounds very magnanimous, and why would anybody object? And yet, the minute it was proposed, up until after it was implemented, almost all of the press was exceedingly negative. Things like Congress is coming for your retirement money, et cetera. And the reason is no one really wanted to talk about these expanded retirement benefits. They were all concerned with the Secure Act's post-retirement implications. And the concern is that this act appends many previously constructed estate plans. It changes how we transfer leftover wealth. There are several sections to this act. They call them titles. All the focus was on Title IV, called revenue provisions. And that's because this act shifts the revenue responsibilities to our beneficiaries. And it does it by eliminating a very important major wealth transfer mechanism called the Stretch IRA. Now, just as a review, a Stretch IRA, also known as a beneficiary IRA, this says that any leftover IRA monies can be bequeathed to a beneficiary. Now, presumably the benefactor was taking required minimum distributions. Those have to continue, but now, or before, those distributions could be spread out over the beneficiary's lifetime. So for a 20-year-old, that could be maybe 80 years. That means very limited amounts of money are having to be declared as income every year. The rest of it's just growing. They've changed that now to say that all of that money must be distributed within 10 years. Why is the government doing this? To understand this, let's look at a thing called the Great Wealth Transfer. You may have heard this. It's been in the papers. It's been talked about. I like to say it's coming to a beneficiary near you. It's predicting that over the next 25 years, 45 million of us retirees are going to transfer up to $65 trillion to beneficiaries. 65 trillion. From the Secure Act's perspective, that represents billions of dollars in potential revenue. There's actually two concerns. Not only the rules are changing in terms of how you have to do this, but then when you add on the inevitable changes in future tax policies, it becomes a very, very concerning issue. And both of these affect our beneficiaries. Let's look at why this is a concern. Let's just take an example. Here's a $200,000 beneficiary IRA given to a 20-year-old. We'll assume a 5% investment rate and assume this person's in a 25% tax rate. Now, under that basis, you can see in the first column there that this fund will grow. I'm reinvesting the required minimum distributions. It'll grow up to $530,000 in 20 years. Under the previous rules, over the first 5 years, the total tax, and this includes tax on some of the gain after it's come out of the IRA, only $5,000. Over 20 years, we're still only $42,000. So for a 20-year-old, having to pay $5,000 in taxes probably isn't too onerous over 5 years. But under the new Secure Act, those same taxes are going to grow up to $31,000, almost $32,000 in the first 5 years, and up to $133,000 within 20 years. That's significant. I'm going to show you a very interesting way to mitigate all of that. Let's look at tax policies. Everybody's hearing about national debt right now. In fact, as of today, they were debating about, and it looks like they passed a way to increase the debt for a few months. Right now, the debt stands at 28 trillion. That's of today, not tomorrow, but today, 28 trillion. I love this part when I'm doing face-to-face presentations of this, because I'll ask the audience, how long do they think it would take them to count to 28 trillion? If you counted one number every second, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. No lunch breaks, no dinner breaks, can't go to sleep, just 24/7, you got to keep counting up to 28 trillion. How long do you think it would take? I'll get answers in a group anywhere from, I don't know, a week, a couple of weeks, maybe a month. The answer is 887,874 years. So if we had to repay this debt at the rate of $1 a second, it's still going to take 887,874 years. And here's the math: 28 trillion seconds divided into minutes, hours, days, and finally years. Now, what if we paid this off at the rate of $1,000 a second? Has to get paid off sometime. It would still take 888 years to do it. To put that into perspective, that's 360 years longer than from the date Columbus discovered this country until today. It's just mind-boggling. And I don't think people in Congress have any idea as to what $1 trillion, or particularly $28 trillion, really represents. Another thing to focus on is top marginal tax rates. The top marginal rate today is 37%, and it's on all income above $510,000. The lowest marginal tax rate was way back in 1913, was only 7%, and ironically was still on income over $500,000. The highest marginal tax rate was during World War II, 94%. But look, it dropped on all income now, on income just over 200,000. And then in 1963, it was lowered again down to 72%. But look at what it was applied to. It was 72% on all income over just $44,000 a year. Now, I show all of that just to show that taxes can change in percentages, and they can change in the dollar amount upon which those taxes are applied. And it's all over the lot. In fact, here's a graph that goes back to showing way back to the early 1900s, when it was way down at 7%. And the far right-hand side there is where it is today, and everything in between. What's interesting to note is when you overlay the national debt. Now, these graphs don't correlate with that, but it just, conceptually here, it's only been in the last few years that our national debt has increased when the tax rates have not. So does anyone think that tax rates will not have to increase, or that our beneficiaries will not be in a much worse tax position than we are in today? If we go back to that great wealth transfer, 65 trillion, if we assume just an average 4% taxable earnings on that, that's $2.6 trillion every single year of taxable earnings. That means for every 1% in tax rate, the government gets $26 billion every year. Don't you know the government is just salivating at the possibilities? And they're not hiding their intent. We've all seen this picture of a couple of weeks ago when AOC wore this, what looks like a very expensive dress to some gala in New York. And it looked like it was spray painted with "tax the rich" on it. So they're not hiding their intent. So we must be prepared. And here are some of the examples that are being debated. I mean, none of these have got terms attached to them or limits or any of this kind of stuff. But here's some of the stuff they're currently talking about. You've probably seen this too. They're looking at increasing the federal tax rate from a current high of 37% up to 39.6%. They want to maintain this net investment income tax of 3.8% and tack on an additional 3% surcharge for anybody making over $5 million. There's talk of increasing the capital gain tax rate up to the ordinary income rate of 39.6%. It's currently only 20%. Capital gains up to 39.6%. They want to eliminate the step up in basis at death. Now, this is absolutely huge, and there's been lots of articles written about this just in this past week. What this means is that when the beneficiary inherits a capital asset, whether it's cash, whether it's an account, whether it's land, whether it's a farm, whether it's a business, there's probably considerable gain in that. But since the benefactor has died, the law right now says that the basis is recast at whatever the current value is. And now it's only going to be taxed on any gain going forward. What this means for people that have farms, for example, if they have to go back and declare that capital gain as taxable, where are they going to get the money to do it without selling farm, without selling part of the land, whatever? It's just egregious. They also are talking about a wealth tax where they actually want to tax unrealized gains. So if you just happen to have a gain in your investment account, you haven't taken it, you haven't moved anything out, and it might go down tomorrow. But if it's there on December 31st, they want to tax it at ordinary rates. They're also talking about eliminating 1031 exchanges. What this does, it says if you've got a business and you, or say a commercial real estate property, and you want to roll it into another property, you can roll the basis in. You can sell one, buy another, roll the basis up, and you keep deferring paying any kind of tax. They want to eliminate all that. They also are talking about eliminating Roth conversions. There's some rules and stuff around that, but still that's their conclusion. So they don't want you taking money now that is tax deferred and still going ahead and paying tax on it, but then move it into a Roth that from that point forward, you never have to pay any tax on it. And they want to mandate IRAs for employees. Why would they do that? They obviously want people like the Secure Act to have these tax deferred retirement accounts. And the government is even talking here about matching contributions for low income employees. They really want to boost that value up. Bottom line is they're coming for our wealth. So is this a problem or an opportunity? Well, it depends on what kind of leftover assets we actually bequeath. And there's only three kinds. There's tax deferred, there's taxable, and there's tax free. Now, we define them by their tax status. The government looks at it from their revenue potential. That's important. Taxable provides some revenue to the government, whether it's capital gains or ordinary income, but there's some there. It's not real exciting to them. Tax-free, of course, there's no revenue. They don't like that at all. And by that, we mean no federal, state, or capital gains tax. So municipal bonds don't count because municipal bonds are only tax-free in the if they are issued in the jurisdiction of where the taxpayer is domiciled. But when we look at tax deferred, that's lots of revenue. It's very popular. It's likely to become a beneficiary IRA. In fact, there's some analysis saying that this may be the largest potential component of that great wealth transfer. Distributions all come out as ordinary income taxable. And with future tax rates going up, that's revenue is just going to keep increasing. This is why it is the focus of the Secure Act, and is also the focus of why they want people to have IRAs. So what should we do? Well, where and when practical, we should move monies from taxable and tax-deferred assets into a tax-free bucket. Now, there's tax implications on taking stuff out of the tax-deferred, of course, so you need to do an assessment, and maybe it would be prudent to take it out in pieces. But whatever we do, get as much of it as we can into that tax-free bucket. Or should we give our beneficiaries their inheritances today? Probably not. Our own cash needs are pretty much unknown, probably. We might have some concerns over what the beneficiaries will do currently with that money. Depends how old they are, I suppose, and what their situation is. We'd probably like to retain some control over that during our retirement and not give up total control. And we'd like to retain some of that money for emergencies. But the goal should be to put our beneficiaries in the best possible tax position for their inherited assets. And that means transitioning to a tax-free bucket whenever and wherever it's practical. And there's only two options. The first option is a Roth IRA. I'm sure you've heard of it. All monies in a Roth IRA accumulate tax-free, but you can only put money into a Roth from earned income, not from investment income or just transferring money from other assets. The contributions are the lesser of $6,000 a year or earned income, a little bit more if you're over age 50. And you're totally ineligible if you're making over 137,000 individually, 203,000 married filing jointly. But there's no age restrictions for contributions. You could keep contributing into your 80s if you were still earning income then. And there's a thing called this conversion from a regular IRA, what they call a backdoor Roth. I was talking about that just briefly. It's all reported as taxable income at conversion, but once it's in the Roth, it is totally tax-free. But it must be owned for a minimum of 5 years in order to be bequeathed as a beneficiary Roth IRA. Otherwise, it has to be cashed in and simply given out as income, as cash. But it's an excellent bequest as leftovers for beneficiaries. There's some eligibility rules and restrictions and things, but it continues, I said, to accumulate tax-free, and all distributions come out tax-free. But distributions can only be made over a lifetime if they're bequeathed as a lifetime annuity. And under the new Secure Act, it all has to be done within 10 years. What's the other tax-free option? It's cash value life insurance. Now, before anybody gets squeamish on this, and you're say, I've got enough life insurance, et cetera, we're not looking at the life insurance side. We're focusing on the cash value side, because this is probably the most valuable and least understood tax-free bucket option that's available. And it may surprise you, and I'll show you why. I'm going to show you a very different perspective on this, because we're going to focus on the cash value, not the death benefit. And we'll show you how to leverage this account now. Think of it as an account to advantage ourselves and our beneficiaries both before and after our death. You see, cash value life insurance enjoys a very unique and protected tax-free status. The cash value grows tax-deferred, actually tax-free if it's held until death. It has, of course, a death benefit. And that death benefit can be taken early for long-term care benefits. That's important. You don't need to deplete your other investments necessarily. And all distributions, if taken as a loan, and there's never a repayment obligation, repayments are never required, that's also all tax-free. There's no restrictions on premium amounts other than what an individual insurance company might impose. The government doesn't impose any. There's no required minimum distributions. Very competitive, predictable, and protected returns. Always positive, never negative. Now, I know you've heard of variable universal life and variable life that do fluctuate with the stock market. We never include that in any of this. This is all non-variable stuff. And of course, it gets leveraged up with a death benefit. I like to say this is like an enhanced Roth IRA with no restrictions. Just for grounding purposes for everybody here, and I'm sure there's people on here that are well versed in this, but when we're talking about pure death benefit, we're talking about term insurance, and that term insurance expires at the end of whatever the term is, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever it is. When we talk standard cash value life insurance, we're talking a much larger death benefit, but with some cash value as part of it. It's all designed not to expire. That's actually the purpose of the cash value. We're going to flip that on its head. And we're going to be focusing just on the cash value from a legacy planning perspective. And we're only buying as much death benefit that as the government requires us to have, and it's a function of how much cash value is in there, and in order to protect the overall tax status. So we're buying just the minimum. So when we look at cash value as an expense item, I want to buy as much death benefit as I need for the least amount of premium that I can get away with. We're talking term insurance, not cash value life insurance. But when we look at this as an asset class, this is an outside the box perspective. Now we're looking at things like tax preferred, few contribution limits, low risk, competitive returns, low or no volatility, full liquidity, leverageability, and protection from creditors. Those aren't life insurance terms. Those are asset terms. And that's the outside the box focus. Now the phrase goes, I want to pay as much premium as I'm permitted and can afford for the least amount of death benefit that's required. That sound counterintuitive? Probably does. But you know, if you play by the rules, you can leverage the value. There are lots of different product types and providers out there, but there's only a very few that are specifically designed for and thus excel at cash accumulation, income distribution, have the preferred premium structure that we need for this, and other key features. And these are the products that people should use to match with their legacy planning goals. For example, if we anticipate that we might like to borrow from the cash value during retirement to supplement income for other purposes, and remember, you don't have to pay it back, then we might want a policy that provides that if and when we do repay the loan, which again is not required, the insurance company will retroactively credit our cash value with all the dividends or interest we would have had we never taken the money out. Can you imagine a bank doing that? An investment company doing that? A mutual fund doing that? Of course not. But believe it or not, that actually exists in the insurance world in a few products. However, not all is guaranteed to be gold like this. Life insurance requires underwriting. The insurance company wants to assess the death benefit risk. How soon will they have to pay it, et cetera? And if they are willing to accept it, at what price are they willing to accept it? That's a big obstacle for us retirees. We're older, obviously. The insurance cost is going to be therefore much higher. We might not be in the best health to be able to get the best price if we could get it at all. But there's a silver lining when it comes to legacy planning. And that is the policy's owner and insured can be two different people. We retirees, benefactors, we can be the owner of these contracts. But our beneficiaries, our children, our grandchildren, can be the insureds. They're younger, obviously healthier, The insurance costs are going to be a lot lower, which is going to mean the cash accumulation is going to accumulate much more efficiently, and they get the death benefit now. They probably are in the market for insurance like we were back then too, but now they get that and they don't have to pay for it. We as the owners get the full use of the cash value now. We have all the policy advantages, all the tax advantages. And when we choose to pass ownership or control to them, we can do that. We can do it before death or at death. And when that does pass, the beneficiary inherits a fully paid up policy. No further premiums are ever required. And yet the death benefit continues to increase. The cash value continues to increase, and it stays all tax-free, growing every single year. Let's look at an example. Steve and Helen are retired. Steve's 66, Helen's 65. We've got a 6-year-old grandson, Kevin. They've got lots of retirement income, but it's heavily in tax-deferred instruments. They hope to leave Kevin a valuable inheritance someday, but they're really concerned about this Secure Act, having those tax-deferred assets now become a beneficiary IRA, and what the future tax rates might be. So here's one thing they could do. They buy a policy on Kevin's life. And I've just used an example here of $12,000 a year in premium, $1,000 a month, and only for 10 years. After 10 years, it's fully paid up. And we're not taking any of this premium out of income. We're taking it out of the tax-deferred assets. It's just a transfer. And then either Steve or Helen retains ownership of the policy, including the cash value, in case of any unforeseen retirement needs. Here are the results. From ages 6 to 15, over that 10-year period, they have bequeathed through this process $120,000, and it's come from their tax-deferred account. At age 22, wow, the cash value is up to $171,000. At age 30, maybe that's when we transfer ownership. They're looking to buy a house or whatever. My word, the cash value is up to $262,000. At age 50, they're now going to hang on to it, $771,000. By age 70, up to almost $2.2 million. And if they'd like to structure that as income after age 70, let's say, this is just, hypothetical, 21 years here, almost $120,000 a year, tax-free, $2.4 million. And yet, remember, the cash value is continuing to grow and the death benefits continuing. So by age 90, the cash value is back up to $817,000, and the death benefit is still $1.6 million that's available now for long-term care, in addition to the actual death benefit going to a beneficiary. You want to help your grandchild with college costs? Stop. Don't write that check yet, even if you can afford it. Instead, borrow the needed amount from the cash value of the policy on your grandchild's life. Then after graduation, repay the loan by writing a check. And why would you go through those machinations? Well, in fact, back in 2019, the Wall Street Journal had a big article on this. 3 ways grandparents can help pay for college. Number 3 was cash value life insurance. Why? Because policy loans do not count as income or assets for student aid applications. The other items were 529 plan and paying the college directly, but both of those do count as income and assets as far as qualifying for any further student aid. So let's look at an example of this. Kevin is now 18. He's headed to college. Steve and Helen want to help with the college costs. They can afford, they figured out, another $20,000 a year, $80,000 in total. And they certainly don't want to impede Kevin's ability to get additional financial aid because he's going to need it. $20,000 a year is not going to cover it. So they borrow $20,000 from Kevin's policy each year for 4 years. They maintain ownership of that policy until sometime after college, and then they write a check to repay the policy loan plus interest. Let's look at the numbers. Again, from ages 6 to 15, they have essentially given Kevin $120,000. They then borrowed $80,000 from the policy and then repaid it at age 22 plus $6,200 worth of interest. They've now given him $206,000. But look at what happened. The minute they repaid that loan, everything was restored. So the same cash value, $262,000, is there at age 30, tax-free. That same income at age 70, if they want it, 2.4 million over 21 years. The same 817,000 of cash still there at age 90, $1.6 million of death benefit, et cetera. Thanks, Grandma and Grandpa. As far as the Secure Act is concerned, again, when this thing was proposed, back in September of 2019, Kiplinger's letter came out and said, how do we mitigate this? And their advice was switch to permanent life insurance. Now, you could also name a spouse as beneficiary, convert to a Roth, or use charitable remainder trust, but they've heavily focused on the life insurance side. So let's look at an example here. Steve dies when Kevin is age 30. The cash value of that policy, remember, is $262,000. Let's just pretend Kevin also inherits from Steve a beneficiary IRA that just coincidentally is the same amount, $262,000. From that, Kevin must now take required minimum distributions over 10 years. That'll all be taxable. We'll assume a growth rate of that beneficiary IRA of 5%, and we'll assume Kevin's in a 25% tax bracket. So here's the growth, and I've reinvested the RMDs, is in year 10, it's grown up to 303,000. By year 20, it's up to 425. But look at the cash value life insurance. After 10 years, it's up to 451. In 20, it's up to 771, all tax-free. What happens if the tax rate doubles and goes up to 50%? That 262,000 in 10 years has been depleted. It's now only 196,000. And in year 20, it's down to 222,000. But the life insurance is still the same, 451, 771. Doesn't matter what the tax rates are, it's tax-free. The moral of this story is taxes erode value. It's just math. So here's an idea. If your required minimum distributions are not needed, use them as premium. You have to pay tax on them anyway. You're not permitted to put them into a Roth IRA, but you can put them into cash value life insurance. So have we accomplished the goals, the silver lining here? We've put our beneficiaries in the best possible tax position. We've put in as much as we could into this tax-free bucket. We've created an incredible, valuable inheritance for our beneficiaries. We've enabled the beneficiaries to receive and enjoy part of that today, both the death benefit, college costs, et cetera. And we retain control over all of it. The use of the cash values, it's our money until we decide to transfer it. And by the way, when you transfer life insurance policies, cash value to the insured, it's a non-taxable event. It's the only exception. Transfer it to somebody else, it's considered a transfer for value, but not to the insured. So all of this can be handled on a totally tax-free basis. This was a cartoon that showed up in the Wall Street Journal a while back. It looks like a boss talking to a subordinate. It says, "It's come to my attention that you've been pushing the box and thinking outside the envelope." Here was another one. Cat litter makers look outside the box to cut costs. But seriously, and in summary, we've worked hard for our money. We're proud of what we've accomplished, the wealth that we have hopefully created. We'd like to leave some of that wealth to our children, our grandchildren. It's our legacy. but there's trouble on the horizon. We'd like it to be their legacy too, but the national debt is up to 28 trillion and growing. When you add to that another 70 trillion of projected entitlement program unfunded liabilities, and that's all the entitlement programs that are there today, not the ones that are being talked about now in Congress. All of that money has to be paid or repaid. And the only source of doing any of that is from taxes. What will that mean from a tax rate perspective for our beneficiaries? 50, 60, 70%? How high will it go? How much of that will actually erode our legacy? When we look at this great wealth transfer, $65 trillion, how much of that is going to be eroded by taxes? Hopefully what you've seen here in this presentation is that problem is preventable. I've spent my entire career in the life insurance business. And I'm embarrassed to say that in all that time, I never focused on cash value being a transferable asset class. I was never looking at it as the tax-free bucket. I was always inside the box, not outside the box. So when I saw what Prevail is doing, I just had to come out and help them spread the word. So hopefully this has given you some food for thought. If you'd like more information on any of this, like to see actual projections for any of your things, or if there's advisors on this call for your clients, contact Prevail. This is what they do, and they do it well. So thank you for your time. I'm going to, I guess, turn it back over to Craig and let him wrap it up.
Well, thank you very much for everybody for attending. I hope you found the information not only valuable, but hopefully some of the information impactful. And as I said, we've got a passion for putting families, individuals in more control and helping to preserve the wealth that they've accumulated, not only to themselves, but obviously for the next generation and for many generations past that. So if you have questions, as Bruce mentioned, please contact the advisor that invited you. For those advisors, I know there are also some advisors on here, happy to discuss specifics here pertaining to any individual clients' concerns that you might have. With that, have a great day, and we look forward to speaking with you all very, very soon. Take care.